Looks okay. So we'd like
I just quickly checked. It's November 26th, actually.
26th. Okay.
I've added the link to the CFP site. I was just double checking. I remember there was 20 something today.
Okay, thank you. So the next part of the meeting is where we meet the new members who would like to introduce themselves. If there's somebody who is new or hasn't been here for a while and you'd like to introduce yourself to the rest of the SIG, now is the time. Is there anyone who'd like to introduce themselves?
Hey everyone, my name is Sriram. I am from India and I'm working at a company called Big Bindery. Yes, I've been part of the SIG CLI meeting a couple of weeks back, but generally I'm not able to join the meeting because of the overlap. But I'm looking forward to contribute more. That's all.
Welcome.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Sorry, it's always hard to know when to start. My name is Andrew. I'm an engineer with VMware. I have a topic today. I wouldn't really consider myself a member. That's not saying I don't want to be, or just it kind of crossed over into SIG CLI. But I'm happy to join, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. And thank you very much.
Welcome, Andrew. Thanks for coming and presenting. Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So are there any sub-project or KEP updates? If not, we can move on to Andrew's presentation. Okay, why don't we move to the open discussion with Andrew's presentation on display name. I have this.
Great, thank you. I will share you disabled screen sharing. I was going to share the browser page, if that's okay, the issue.
Yes, that would be good.
I mean, you can share it if you would like.
Yeah, why don't I try that?
Yeah, let me paste it in here. We'll have to defer to that. I had an internal Confluence page where I documented it, but VMware's Confluence is down this morning, so we're all just kind of wondering what to do now. Git is still up, but yeah, here's the Git page. I actually copied most of the stuff in there when I filed this issue, so it should be good if you share that.
Okay, how's that?
Great. Yeah, okay, so basically what I am asking is that we add a new annotation, a well-known annotation to the page, well-known labels, annotations, and taints. And so there's some context here. I started by, who did I ping? I think I pinged Andy Goldstein, who I used to work with Cluster API, what his thought, maybe Dems, on where he thought I should start this conversation. And I think, no, you know what it was, is I looked in the docs, I pinged Jonas Roslin, who works in the communication SIG docs. And I started there. They suggested SIG architecture, and I got moved to SIG CLI. That's how I ended up in SIG CLI. But essentially, what we're dealing with at VMware is we're using Kubernetes APIs as our IaaS API layer. It's part of our IaaS strategy. And if you think about Amazon objects, for example, they have what I would call friendly names, but they also have unique IDs, right? Well, Kubernetes objects have unique IDs. They have an object ID, but the object name is immutable, and it's also not very friendly if you want to have, I mean, there's DNS restrictions on it, right? And so we wanted a way to both solve the friendliness aspect of it, to make it human readable, and to make it mutable if somebody wants to change it. Ideally, if you scroll down to the goals, I had the goals, non-goals. Originally, this was a label. Then I had forgotten that labels have the same DNS restrictions on values. I made it a label originally because I really wanted this to be server-side indexed so that clients could basically search for one or more objects that had based on their what I called the display name or the human readable name, right? But we weighed the benefits of the human readable aspect of it and then the restrictions placed on a label, and we realized, well, while a label may be mutable, it's no more friendly than the actual object name. And because of that, we moved to the annotation. And so I looked upstream, and internally, I think what we're calling is just vmware.com/display name. I looked upstream, and the thing that was closest was Kubernetes.io description. But that is really, I mean, it's strictly about it. If you read the fine print, right, it's for a description of the object. And what I was looking for more is what I would again call the display name. And the reason I think it would be beneficial for it to be a standard is because eventually, right, we could build some type of support into the ecosystem for things like, well, maybe there is a standard length that we limit it to, as opposed to it just being added or whatever the annotations allow. I found the annotation validator and I forgot what the size limit is, but it's, because description, it can be fairly long. I think I've seen some annotations as long as a megabyte. And then also we could place limitations on it, like only human readable Unicode or UTF, human readable visible UTF-8 characters, things like that. But also it would be really great eventually if standard tooling such as kubectl would have, I could foresee in the future, a -- display name flag. And you can see here that's a non-goal for an immediate change, but I could in the future see, hey, if I'm listing objects, I might want to list their display name right next to the name column. And that's the other reason for this being a standard label. It is so that all resource types, annotation, all resource types, no matter what type they are, can say, hey, if we ever need to have a friendly, mutable way to describe this object, there is a well-known annotation that we can use, and any client, whether that is a GUI, whether that's kubectl, any application that surfaces Kubernetes data can know about this annotation. And if they're displaying an object, listing objects, just like you could do with EC2, right? You could see, okay, here's the, what I would call the ARN, the Amazon resource name. In this case, it's really the Kubernetes object name, right? But then next to it, you might have the friendly name, which would be the value of this annotation. And so that's kind of the background and reason behind this. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah. So in general, the annotation that we're trying to overlook, and if I remember correctly, the original ask that DIMS had to push their request towards SIG CLI was to ensure that we actually start with the fact that we are the primary consumer of the annotation. The problem with the path annotation, and there's a couple of them already defined, is that we do not always consume all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And those
did you say path annotation? I'm sorry.
Past annotation.
Past annotation. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The list that you, if I remember correctly, you linked the list somewhere in your issue, which lists all the world annotation. Not all of them are actively used in the current Kubernetes ecosystem.
Sure.
Because oftentimes people just started creating.
It's the very first link in the issue.
Yeah.
They definitely do, and I'm trying to avoid that here.
It has some ups and downs to a certain degree. We figure out that we will come up with several annotations that were very specific to kubectl. One of them was container or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head, because we initially called it, I think there's a default container is the name.
Sure.
Initially came up with something different that was used for logs, And if I remember correctly, it was for log container or something
I
like that.
actually remember that because I was slightly involved in an issue. I'd proposed something similar, and yeah,
and then
exactly.
eventually we migrated that. Well, actually, it will be much more useful if we can reuse that annotation in a broader scope for kubectl, and
Sure.
that's how we came up with the default container.
And I saw the app one, by the way. And the thing is this doesn't reflect the name of the application that this is involved in necessarily, because you might use this across multiple services and PVCs. They all might share the same app name.
Right, because that was one of my first questions. In the
I
Slack
think I
conversation.
answered that in the Slack thread.
Why not the name, the app Kubernetes name? And you explicitly pointed out that an app is basically a
collection of resources.
A collection of resources, exactly. Rather,
and this is also a label as well.
Yeah. And in your case, you specifically are trying to address the issue of human readable names. So,
and I'm trying to avoid fragmentation too. I mean, and not for unselfish reasons, right? Because
no, that's totally fine. But the situation as it stands today is you listed kubectl over there as a non-goal, which basically
no, I listed it as a non-goal in the as a timeline of the flag. I'm not viewing the definition of this to be dependent upon kubectl implementing some type of flag or necessarily needing to acknowledge this right now. Because I can imagine there may need to be further discussion about how you would integrate something like this into kubectl. By the way, one of the things we discussed internally was the fact that there is no way to change the output like of that first field other than print custom fields. Like name is always showing up first, right? And so
but that was intentional, because
of course
is the main information. Even for CRDs, if you specify the additional print columns, the name will always appear. The name and the creation date will always appear first, and then only then you can specify those additional fields that you care about printing for your particular CRD, which was also intentional because we want to make sure that the name is there. So that's where I'm trying to figure out if you can propose a particular change to the kubectl, which would benefit from having the
it would be the display name flag, as like maybe always show it as the second field if you choose that, because one of the non-goals is this can't be what you use to define object relationships, obviously. But it would be nice if users could just use a standard flag and say, well, show me the friendly names, as opposed to having a bunch of resources or CRDs that all define bespoke annotations or columns or fields with that information. It would standardize the way people consume it.
No, that's totally fine. What I'm looking at it is the display name is something that I would primarily use in the web UI function, rather than,
I will admit that is where we are largely looking at using it as well. But yeah, go ahead.
That's why a lot of the sub project created their own display names, because that provides additional context. I don't know how much the limit is, because I know OpenShift has a similar.
I checked the Kubernetes annotation. It's rather large. I know we've stuffed a lot of info and annotations. So
but the thing is, for a lot of the CLI operations, what you actually care about is the shortness of the information that you can quickly get. I'm not 100% sure where in the kubectl world that kind of annotation would make sense and provide the necessary value. We are already struggling with a lot of places where people are not aware, and actually we are very hesitant adding extra flags to a lot of the commands.
Sure. Well, I was thinking it would mainly be the get command, and I also I'd also kind of argue that you probably already have this field or column for many resources or custom resources, because people don't have a standard, and to me this is just standardizing something that I imagine many people are already doing with custom ones, and so it's I think standardization is often a good thing.
Right, but what I'm trying to say is that when you're working with kubectl, especially with get commands, what you care about is primarily the readability. So the amount of information that you can fit in rather small screen. And very often what we actually do is we actually cut the information that is presented by kubectl get in a lot of places. If a particular information, for example, of labels or annotation, if it has more than,
You
I
aligned
don't
it.
know,
Yeah, you
yeah,
aligned it.
we will basically do that if it's allowed. So I'm worried that in the case of the display name, we would basically end up the flag for displaying the name, which would then be quickly shortened, and people would naturally use the longer name for the display because, like we agreed both, it is primarily for the UI, for the web UI or any kind of
Well,
like
sure.
more rich UI. So
We've
I'm a
had-
little
we-
bit hesitant on the kubectl side of things, and this is I
Okay.
think the
Well, this is why I kind of didn't think it belonged in SIG CLI. I think this is no offense intended, but I share your concerns, right? But so kubectl isn't the only consumer of Kubernetes, and so having a standard, and this is why it was also a non-goal to have that flag. Having a standard annotation for all the other consumers of it has value outside of kubectl, because what you're describing is kind of saying, you know, the use of annotations or labels that we add kind of have to pass the kubectl test before they could be standardized. And I don't necessarily think that's true, right?
I mean, the other important thing is if you look at Kubernetes by default, at least, does not provide any dashboard or anything like that.
Sure.
I'm just looking it up. I can't find it. But the dashboard project is, which belongs under SIG CLI, is entirely separate sub project.
Yeah.
I don't know where is it, under 6 or somewhere else. I don't know. But it is not a default thing. So the reason that we're trying to stay away to a certain degree from defining those ecosystem-wide labels is because we don't want to enforce anyone. People already started using a lot of those. Yeah, I can't find the dashboard. Whatever. So
Sure. I just but you have description, right? It just feels like display name is a fairly innocuous standard that could be implemented without like the value you add versus any penalty. I think, you know, value outweighs it. But I mean, the other take I have on it is if we could invert this instead of looking for reasons not to do it, could you describe the reasons to add to the standard labels and annotations page? Because I just hear like general hesitancy, and I'm curious is it something that has to be useful across the entire I mean, I'm just trying to understand what the bar is.
Primarily, I would say a reasonable bar is if kubectl is one of the primary consumers of a particular annotation, that's a very good bar. Or one of the core elements of Kube is the primary consumer, what it is that actually building on top of a particular annotation or label, then that is literally the best option. A lot of those app Kubernetes and a lot of those, they were added in the initial days, and they fall under the SIG apps. There was a sub project which was trying to define what an application is, and that actually did not end up being too widely used because a lot of the vendors created their own notion of application. I think there is still a application sub-project under Kubernetes 6, which we probably need to revisit. And I spoke with a couple of folks that we will very likely just archive it, especially that it never progressed out of the uh, beta. So it never first got the adoption that we're initially hoping for, nor it moved forward. So it doesn't seem to be used. So we don't want to repeat a similar mistake again by adding additional annotation that we will publish in that reference doc, and then potentially some people will start using it, and then we will just stop
Okay.
supporting it. So
I'm just concerned that
yeah,
this will promote fragmentation without it. And I mean, that's fine, but
I totally understand your objections and feelings around the topic. I had a similar conversation just a couple minutes ago with regards to providing libraries for certain functionalities that reside in the core cubes. And my response was that if you are proposing a library, and labels are not much different here, you are proposing something that the
I'm
core.
sorry. Could someone possibly mute themselves? There's a lot of background noise all of a sudden. It feels like somebody else is on.
Okay.
So go ahead. I just couldn't hear you. Sorry.
Yeah,
about
sure. So basically, my answer to the person when I was talking with him with regards to the library, and the same rules apply basically for annotation as well. If you have a consumer within the core Kubernetes, whether that'll be a library, and for example, in SIG CLI, there was a time when we decided to expose the libraries that we use for building all of the commands, the CLI runtime. We are the primary consumers of this library, and we are also exposing this as a library for others to build on top of. If you have the opportunity to combine both, that's a very reasonable bar, which allows people to expose certain parts of the code. If the library will be not used internally within the cube, it is in the risk of being
That's a fair bar. That's fair.
going in different directions, and that's a significant risk and significant maintenance cost that we have to think of whenever we're trying to add any additional
No,
code.
that's a reasonable bar, and I can take. Go ahead.
That's basically where we're currently thinking.
That's reasonable.
At least is very close to the
It is, but I wouldn't tell people to use it because of how it's documented.
Yeah.
I could expect that to be a paragraph, and just like you said, there could be length concerns, and I would be hard pressed because it does exist as an upstream standard and documented in such that way that I would not feel comfortable for an application ecosystem built on that to be used as a friendly name. But what you've provided is information I can take back to my other engineers and state, look, we may make an effort at this company to converge upstream with standards and promote standards. But if the guidance is going to be for things like this, unless it is useful within the core Kubernetes ecosystem, then we should just go our own way. Because that seems like what you said, right? At least with regards to annotations and labels. Unless it's going to be used within Kubernetes itself, it doesn't belong in as a standard.
Yeah, that's a reasonable answer. And if you have a little bit of time and folks who would be interested to pursue this and get this thing merged into Kube, that is equally valid option as well.
When you say merged into Kube, what do you mean? Like,
as in get it implemented and merged into core Kube, whether that'll be kubectl or some kind of a controller or something.
Yeah, I can re-engage it on that level. Like if I was going to merge it into core Kube, the thing I would pursue, quite frankly, is I would want to build some type of admission controller for it to say, here are, it can't just be everything an annotation allows. It would have, visible printed characters, maybe limit it to 100, some reasonable, standard for the value because of like the same concerns you shared. In fact, internally, we're using VMware.com display name. There is an admission webhook for that, like printed characters. I think we limited it to 84 characters long because that happens to be our internal object name length, so that we can, if we want to reflect that within vSphere, we could. But yeah, something something like that. And that's one of the reasons it was a non-goal. I didn't want to go down that route because at this time, because when I asked the docs group, well, what does it take to add something to this page? Like, it's adding it to this page. And what you outlined is, well, the bar is really, it's added to this page if there's use for it within Kubernetes. And so
Yeah. I
can pursue that separately.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment, basically.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
I also think that the display name flag, I think that there would probably be some hesitancy there. But I do think that it would be possible to print the annotation with custom columns.
Oh yeah, you could do that, or JSON path. We do that today. But like I said, it's all about a standardization. It's about usability. Custom columns isn't friendly. A JSON path isn't
Yeah.
friendly.
Yeah.
A flag that's literally printed a split, because you can't, the name's going to be first. But be nice is, if I want to print any object, if it has a display name, show it second. So I really was thinking about the long term here on implementing some type of standard, because that, frankly, Kubernetes objects, and I get why object names are what they are. I kind of had to explain that to my engineers as well. The ARNs, right, are UUIDs essentially. Well, they're not, but they might as well be. Object names, there's this idea that because of the way we do object relationships, they try to make them as friendly as possible, but they can't quite get there. And so even though there's this UUID, it's essentially the object name that is the ARN, and it's immutable. It's not friendly.
It's close, basically, because you can get rid of an object and recreate it under the same name rather quickly. The UID
that's not the same thing at all, depending on how many, what the deletion of an object and the recreation of it, depending on what that object controls, I wouldn't view that as the same.
Yeah, but the UID is usually used very deep internally,
sure,
to make sure that only the old the actually removed resource is being properly garbage collected, rather than the new one, because that was an issue from a couple of years back, where garbage collector relied entirely on the names rather than use at some point in time, and that was a risk. But yeah, I know what you're trying to.
Can I tell you the reason this all started? And it's so silly and dumb. We have this thing called virtual machine image, right? And we switched to, and you could have multiple sources for them, different libraries. You could have two libraries that had the same image name. And so originally, if there were conflicts, we would use generate name to create a unique name. It would get a unique suffix. But we moved to a proper image registry model. And I said, why don't we just do something called like VMI, totally original, right? And then we SHA some deterministic piece of it and take the first 17 characters. And so now all image names are VMI dash first 17 characters of a deterministic SHA sum. Well, a SHA sum based on some deterministic information about the image. But that's also makes it harder for people to know what image they want. So when you print them, there's a printer column that's got the image name, but it was all about, what do we call that column? Technically, the image name is the VMI. And if you go look on something like Amazon and you see their AMIs, that's the image ID column, right? But we can't impact that column. That is the name column forevermore, right? And it's the VMI. So we've got this other column. I think we just called it the display name. And I don't want to call it image name because the object is an image. The name column is the name column. So that's the image name. Has there ever been any consideration on being able to change, like with a CRD, the name of the name column for when it prints out? So maybe it could be called ID or something that users might want to call it, or customers, people might want to call it. I know this is so pedantic and dumb, but if in that column, if I could have influenced the name column to be called ID and then had a separate column called name,
For consistency with the core resources, they stick with the name.
Yeah.
Because if I remember correctly, the CRDs inherit a lot of the
Data.
metadata.
I
yeah,
know, like
and
the additional printer column, I didn't know maybe if there was talk of another annotation there that, not annotation, cube builder, whatever the metadata that you add that influences the generation that would allow you to say, here's what the name column is actually called when it's printed out. But that was the background on this. Like, what do we call that column? And we set it on display name, and it's like, okay. And then I realized internally, we're gonna have this problem for other resources. So I'm gonna standardize on this. And there was agreement. And then it's like, we should pursue to see if there's interest in upstream to standardize on this, because, and that's how it all started. But I agree with your assessment. I think that makes sense. It definitely gives me a good reasoning to go back to the other folks involved and say, look, this is a fair bar. Thank you for being clear, because if the answer was we just don't want to, then it's like, well, Andrew, did you push hard on it? Did you make a good argument? Your reasoning is fair and sound, so it makes sense. Thank you.
Out of pure curiosity, are the images, the VMIs that you have grouped under, like, each having a unique name, are they grouped by, I don't know, some kind of like, they share, like, all of them are the same image, just different version or something like that?
So you could have, we have something called content library, and you could bind one or more content libraries to a namespace. So imagine you had Ubuntu 2204, and two different libraries had both added that image, and they just left whatever the name of the image was by default. So when it gets added to both of those libraries, and if somebody bound both of those libraries to the same namespace, you run into the problem of, okay, how do we determine that this is a unique image? Or how do we determine that it's different? Like, do we run into that problem? What if they are the exact same image? And there's just too much that we don't know. So what we end up doing is we end up saying, we're going to hash what we call the UUID of the object in the content library. So even if you have the exact same image at the moment, they will show up as separate objects in Kubernetes with different VMI IDs. Their display name will both be the same. Now, what we want to do long-term, and I'm trying to get this resourced, is can we dive into depending on how big the image is, can we hash the image and see, is it really, if it's the exact same set of files, we only need to show it once. But what we found in the past is we'll have two different images that just have the same name, because people can publish their own images as well, and they aren't the same, and the names would conflict. And so, and they get there by virtue of those libraries that administrators can bind to a namespace. So the admins aren't necessarily checking what images are in the libraries when they bind them.
So I'm not sure how much familiar you are with the API bits, but
what do you mean the API bit?
The API server and the
I'm somewhat
to create virtual resources.
So actually, I mentioned the virtual resources in my internal documentation, because I originally referred to things as resource names instead of object names. That's when I learned about virtual resources, because they distinguished object names or names of concrete resources. And so I stopped using resource name. I've not used virtual resources, but I'm now aware of them because of this deep dive.
In OpenShift, we have a bunch of virtual resources defined to cover the images. And each image will have a name, but that name usually is referred by the SHA of the image to make sure that this is unique. Now, users prefer to have some more stable names rather than SHAs for the images. So we created for them image stream tags, which basically map a particular set of images
to a same virtual resource.
The same virtual resource, and then tag, which is basically part of the name, the part of the name. It basically is similar to what you are working with any kind of container registry. So you have the namespace, and you have the name of the resource, and then after the column, you have the tag. In a similar fashion, we basically map the images to appropriate resources. So maybe something along those lines.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I might reach out to you. Yeah, I might reach out to you in Cube Slack. One of the conversations we had when we were talking about this is getting a tangent, but the image registry was, it's like, Kubernetes uses images. It doesn't surface images, at least in core, right? It's not used as a way to discover images. And I kind of was pushing against the idea that we should be using Kubernetes at all to surface this information, but because it's part of our IaaS strategy, it's being used that way. And so this is when we're encountering these issues, but it sounds like you've kind of encountered the same thing. So I might reach out to you if that's all right.
Yeah, sure, definitely. OpenShift has a thing that is called image stream that basically covers this entire thing, and it is basically built as a virtual resources around just images. The images is the only actual resource, whereas both the image streams or tags for image streams is basically a mapping so that it's easier for users to work with these. But
Got it.
yeah, something along those lines. I'll probably try to figure out. Might be beneficial for you and what and the situations that you're in.
So one of the managers I work with, Sabri Mergensen, used to work on OpenShift when he was at Red Hat. So I might ping him as well. Thank you for that. He's at VMware now, but yeah. Well, it currently called VMware, but
yeah, I'll send you the article that I wrote. I'll try to figure it out.
Right. Yeah, and I know we're a little off topic, but I think this matter, at least the immediate matter, is settled. If you want to move forward, and I can follow up with you offline about this. I really do appreciate y'all listening, though. Thank you. I will mark the issue closed, by the way, and I'll, if it's okay with y'all, what I'll mark is like we had the conversation in the SIG meeting, and we may revisit this, but the conclusion was adding new annotations, display names, labels, whatever the bar should be. Are they going to be used as a core part of Kubernetes? For the sake of standardization, there's just been too much experience in the past that unless it's used core, there just may not be the resources around it to keep it, sane or something like that. I'll leave a note in the issue for people to find.
Cool, thanks.
Well, again, thanks, Andrew, for showing up and presenting. We appreciate you joining us and giving us the background for this issue.
Oh no, I appreciate y'all entertaining it and sharing the information about how y'all view that page. I may still come back with a patch for that page and may simply suggest that we have a note on there if you're interested in adding to this. Like maybe I can work with Dims or Jonas to craft messaging around what we discussed here, and for people that might want to investigate it in the future, because it was kind of like wasn't clear on what the path is for that page and how we engage it. Maybe it's just start with the SIG that you seem most appropriate. I don't know. Thanks again.
So I think that is our discussion for today, unless there is another issue that's not on the agenda. Is there any last items that we want to get to as a SIG? If not, we're going to close and give everybody a little bit of time back. Again, thanks for joining. We will see you within 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone.